Thank you, Mr Wilson. I move that this House has considered e-petitions 133610, 12533, 123324, 154593, 133767, 133540, all relating to the UK's exit from the European Union. Mr Wilson, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I know a lot of these petitions that they've now closed and they've been on the books for a few months now. Some of them have been overtaken by events and subsequent debates that we've had in the chamber, but they're still important to discuss and to continue to discuss over the coming months. There are effectively three of the 6 petitions are essentially about the timing of Article 50, about when we invoke it, if at all. Now, the Prime Minister, since these in recent weeks, has said that the government intends to invoke Article 50 by the end of March. And why has she picked that date? I mean, if you look at where we were just a few months ago, the Department for Exiting the European Union wasn't in existence. So a lot of it has to be about building capacity. Now, as far as I understand, there are 180 staff in the UK and 120 people that can be called upon for advice in Brussels as well. And we obviously need to build up a strategy through conversations, through discussions with devolved assemblies, small businesses, large PLCs, councils, local government associations and major metropolitan bodies. I know that there has been and there continues to be planned meetings with business groups, representatives of universities, the charitable sector, farming, fishing, and having round-table discussions with a number of cross-cutting organisations and people as well. The Secretary of State and the Department has been performing sectoral and regulatory analysis, looking at over 50 sectors and cross-cutting regulatory issues. And I think it's important that we invoke Article 50 when and only when we in the UK are ready to do so. I noticed a quote from Martin Schulz, the President of the European Parliament, that was very indicative. He said, "I consider it to be very possible that the Brits know exactly what they want at the start of negotiations, but the Europe still won't be able to speak with a single voice." It is important that we know exactly what we want when we invoke Article 50 by the end of March. Now, those of us that want to, those petitioners that wanted us to invoke Article 50 immediately, I suspect signed that petition because they didn't believe it would happen. Those of the petitioners that wanted us never to invoke Article 50 effectively have buried their head in the sand after the referendum and are trying to replay that debate that we had before June the 23rd. For those people that wanted Parliament to vote on Article 50, this is a continuing debate that we had a debate in the main chamber last week. There's a court case going on in the High Court at the moment, and I read a very interesting article written in the Telegraph by the Honourable Member for Esher and Walton, who has significant government legal background before he was elected to this place, where he surmised that it's government that negotiates and signs treaties, and Parliament makes sure that we can comply with the international obligations under UK law. The government, and I agree with their position, takes the view that the royal prerogative is the right thing to do to be able to invoke Article 50. That's effectively government negotiating and signing treaties. And then Parliament will be able to scrutinise our discussions as we seek to leave the EU, but they will also be able to have a significant say over the coming years, over the coming 2 years, in order to shape our exit for the UK from the European Union, but also through the Great Repeal Bill, but also shaping our future relationship with the European Union, which will be taken under a separate negotiating process, if you like. Yeah.
It's all very well as saying what we want up to the point where Article 50 is triggered, but after that point, the EU will tell us what we're going to get. We won't have any negotiating power. So wouldn't it be better, before we push the trigger, to have an idea of what we're likely to get, and then have a referendum on the exit package, which is very different to what people reasonably understood when they made their vote on the 23rd of June.
Well, Scully.
Thank you for the intervention, but I would disagree with that because I don't believe that the European Union will tell us what we will get. This will be part of an open negotiation. Why? Because there are 27 different countries that will seek to... There is not one body. There are 27 different voices within the European Union, excluding ourselves, that will each be fighting for their patch, each be fighting for their sectors that are important to them, and they will have that in mind when it comes to the joint negotiations. The one that's often cited is the German automotive industry, where they sell 10% of all of their cars to the UK market. Now, they're not going to want to let BMW, Audi and Volkswagen, all those major brands, suffer as a result of an EU negotiation with the Commission, with Brussels burying their head in the sand. So each corner, each country will fight for their own sectors, and as will the UK. Yeah.
For your generosity. But wouldn't you agree that what he's really describing is that these 27 countries will decide amongst themselves what they will give us? It's not us deciding. They'll have a big argument about it, as he said, but then they'll say, this is what you're getting. And if the German car manufacturers think it's better to keep out the Japanese through tariffs and sell more Mercedes to Spain and have less to Britain, that's another decision. But ultimately, they will decide collectively and then tell us what we're getting.
Well, Scully.
There are two things. I mean, I think when you're invoking Article 50, you're effectively working out how you separate the UK from the rest of the EU. That's dividing up the assets, the liabilities, how we move forward in terms of the institutions. But that is, although it's intertwined, it's slightly separated from our future relationship. The Article 50 actually says that we have to take into account our future relationship, but I think there is plenty of time. We need to use the full 2 years in order to work out our future relationship. But in terms of what I wouldn't want to see is us being hamstrung by waiting to invoke Article 50 because we are trying to limit ourselves in our future negotiations with our future relationship with the EU. Frankly, from my personal point of view, I think this is what actually hamstrung David Cameron in the first place, because if he'd asked for more, and if he hadn't limited himself in his renegotiations with the EU earlier on last year, we may be in a very different place in the lead up to the referendum. We may still be voted to remain. So I don't want to be in the position now where we are actually limiting ourselves in our negotiations on how we move forward once we've left the EU, just to get to this point in time by next March when we're actually invoking Article 50 and starting the process. Yeah.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. You mentioned a moment ago the issue of devolved assemblies, parliaments and governments. Can you be a bit clear about what role he feels that they should have? Because the crucial fact is that, of course, that when we went into the European communities as it was then, we didn't have devolution. And a significant amount of the responsibilities have now been devolved in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. And that has got to be an absolutely crucial part. The people of those devolved administrations and governments having a very clear say on this process. What does he think, what role does he think they should play?
Well, Scully.
I think this is why the Prime Minister made a big effort to actually go and visit Edinburgh very, very quickly after the referendum, after she was elected Prime Minister, to show her intentions to engage with the devolved Parliament in Scotland and the assemblies. And as I said, the discussions over the next few months will absolutely be integral to speaking to the devolved parts of the UK, and also councils and metropolitan bodies as well, so going right down to smaller units of government as well. This is absolutely crucial.
On that point, the Honourable Member for Wayne.
Yeah.
Very grateful indeed to the Honourable Member. In July, the Prime Minister mentioned that Scotland would be involved in the negotiations. In October, the Secretary of State for exiting the EU said that we would be consulted. Which one is it?
Paul Scully.
Well, I think we are going to be all involved in negotiations, because we're all going to be involved in the debates, in the discussions that are here over the next couple of years. And I think that's all parliamentarians, all devolved bodies, as I say, and and business. We need to involve the country in this debate because it's an important debate to have moving forward. The discussion that we had during the referendum debate, as I said when I was campaigning to leave, was that this was a 40 to 50 year decision that we were taking, and which is also why, frankly, as someone that's wanted to leave the EU for 20, 25 years, I'm quite happy to be patient for 6 months before we invoke Article 50, because we need to get our exit right, and then we need to spend those 2 years to make sure that we get our future working relationship and trading relationship with the EU right as well. This is an absolutely crucial period for the UK to get it right for the economy, to get it right for immigration, to get it right for control and sovereignty within this country as well. The three things, the pillars that I was talking about. But we will have our chance to vote as parliamentarians in the Great Repeal Bill, which repeals the Act on the day that we leave, comes into effect the day we finally leave the EU. That's transposing EU law into domestic law. We can then choose, we'll be taking control. Now that and subsequent bills will be the votes that will determine how we leave the EU. That's Parliament making sure that we're complying with the international obligations under UK law. One of the petitions talks about freedom of movement of people. It's entitled "Not to Allow Freedom of Movement as Any Part of the Deal with the EU After Brexit." Well, the Prime Minister has been clear that we need to restrict the freedom of movement. By doing so, we can actually create a system that allows us to control numbers and encourage the brightest and the best. But at the moment, we're limited in this ambition. One of the biggest pull factors that we have in migration is people talk about benefits, they talk about other things, but actually the biggest pull factor, to my mind, for migration, especially from within the EU, is the jobs that we've created over the last few years, the success story that the UK has had in creating so many jobs in very, very difficult conditions. You have youth unemployment in Greece of 48%, Spain 43%, Italy 39%. Now, we can attract, and we should be attracting, skilled workers and entrepreneurs from across the world. If I just finish my sentence, I was just going to say that naturally EU citizens on our doorstep are likely to be the most numerous that are coming in, but because of their location. And what I wouldn't want to see, I want to end a sense of entitlement, and I want to be able to make sure that skilled workers from across the world, whether it's Bangladesh, Australia, America, Canada, India, have equal footing at coming into this country than unskilled workers from other parts of the EU. I'd gladly give way.
Thank you. I appreciate you giving way. Just to expand, really, explore the pull factors, would my honourable friend agree with me that the pull factors are not benefits and the obvious things that people do refer to, but more even than the things that you refer to, but also the English language and the national living wage created by this Conservative government are two other pull factors which we simply cannot change?
Paul Scully.
My honourable friend makes a fantastic point, and he's absolutely right. And this is why I believe that that the UK will be on a sure footing, a steady footing, when it comes to negotiate with the EU, because of the rule of law, because of the language, because of the trading history and the trading relationships that we've built up around the world. We still are a very attractive location for locating businesses, for inward investment, for the reasons that my honourable friend has said. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for giving me. On the subject of skilled workers, the honourable member mentions the importance of attracting skilled workers. So on that point, the skilled workers that we have working in the United Kingdom, who form a huge part of our National Health Service and indeed our teachers, what would the honourable member say to them when no guarantees can be given from this government about their continued ability to stay, teach and keep us well in this country?
Paul Scully.
Thank you. I thank the honourable lady for that intervention. When one talks about the huge numbers in the National Health Service, I think it's important to remember that they are absolutely valued part of the health service. It's 4% from within the EU, 15% of NHS staff comes from outside the UK, and a third of that is from within the EU. But nonetheless, it is important to value skilled workers and entrepreneurs, and we do need to attract the brightest and the best. As I say, it's effectively taking control. It's taking control because it means that the UK can determine our own immigration policy. That may be no change. It may be radical change. But that decision will be taken here in this place with full consultation of the UK public, rather than having one arm effectively tied behind our back by rules and regulations and the determination of Brussels. But that doesn't limit our compassion. It doesn't limit our ambition as well. So we should never make sure that we confuse and conflate immigration of the type I've been talking about with our responsibilities to refugees. Now, one of the petitions talked about the fact that the 23rd of June should be designated as Independence Day and celebrated annually. Well, I think there must have been a joke in Hollywood that they actually premiered Independence Day 2 on the day of the referendum result, I think Friday the 24th. But I think someone in one of the movie studios had a sense of humour there. But, 48% of people voted to remain. There's 27 countries looking at their trade and relationship with the EU, with the UK. Expats around the EU looking at their future. The world is looking at what we are doing. I'll happily give way.
Thank you, Mr Wilson. And could I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way? He has just referred to trading relationships, and obviously as part of those negotiations there would need to be, subsequent to that, individual trade agreements with each of the other 26 European countries. Is the honourable gentleman aware of how long it takes to obtain a trade agreement and then an export certificate with countries outside the EU? Because in relation to pork exports, we're still waiting with China since October or November of last year, when the original temporary approval was given.
Well, Scully.
Thank you. I thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention. I think I was right in thinking that the Honourable Lady was talking about having individual trading agreements with each of the EU countries, which isn't possible, because the point of being a member of the EU is you can't negotiate your own trade deals. But so if we leave, we would have to have a single trade deal with the European Union countries that remain. We would also then need to actually negotiate our own trade deals, which would be free to do for the first time in 40-odd years, with other countries around the world, including the ones that the European Union already has a trading deal with, but also, significantly, the ones that it doesn't, the many, many, many countries. There are 168 countries outside the EU, and they get on quite fine, actually. But yes.
Could I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way again? The point I was trying to illustrate is that it already takes a considerable, inordinate length of time to negotiate those trade deals with other countries outside the European Union. So how does that bode for the subsequent situation in terms of trade deals and trade agreements post-Brexit?
Well, if I can use what may seem a slightly odd analogy, because I've been in business 20 years, and 2 years ago I negotiated a lease for an office that I took up. It cost me about £2,000–3,000 of solicitors' fees and about 3 months to organise. When I got my constituency office, I already had a nice lease to use as a blank as a template. It cost me exactly £0 and took me a week to organise. So when we actually come to leave the EU, we can either start with a blank sheet of paper, or we can start with things that actually already work. So I don't envisage yeah.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. I mean, I think he's grossly oversimplifying the complexity of negotiating trade arrangements as somebody who's previously worked on those in government as well. But I wanted to ask him a separate question. He's talking about his own business experience. The volatility that we're seeing in the value of the pound at the moment is causing a great deal of uncertainty for businesses. For example, the steel industry in my own constituency, who are seeing the value of the scrap that they use fluctuate because of the denomination of that in the dollar, but also their their exports at the moment, you know, being sort of falsely boosted by the value of the pound as it is at the moment. Does he agree that we need to look very, very carefully at how that sort of uncertainty and uncertainty that's being created by the government is possibly giving a false impression of how the economy or different businesses might be performing before we get into the detail of any kind of fixed-term trade arrangements, particularly in certain sectors and with certain countries?
Thank you for the intervention. I was, thank the Honourable Gentleman for the intervention. Of course, I was using an extreme view analogy in my lease. I'm not expecting these things to take 5 minutes. I don't think anybody has ever expected trade deals to take 5 minutes to organise. You can't literally lift a bit of paper up and just transpose it to another. But on the other hand, the point I was making is that you don't necessarily need to start with a blank sheet of paper. We ought to be looking at a bespoke model for the UK, but that doesn't mean that you start again from a blank sheet of paper. You can pick a little bit of here, a little bit from there, depending on what we want and our mix of businesses, which is different from Switzerland, it's different from Canada, it's different from Turkey, it's different from all of the different countries that are often cited. I think the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union in his speech last week, he discussed about how we have Norway, which is inside the single market and outside the customs union, Turkey, which is inside the customs union and outside the single market, and Switzerland, which is not in the single market, but has equivalent access to all its productive and manufacturing services. There's not a single entity, but a spectrum of outcomes, and we'll be seeking to get the best of that spectrum of outcomes. But that still leaves us building blocks that we can use in order to do that. With regard to the uncertainty that the Honourable Gentleman talked about, this is why we need to come at this with a sense of mutual respect and coordination and cooperation and building up a national consensus rather than just certainly political point scoring about it, certainly without people burying their head in the sand about in the referendum, which is of I'm not talking about this debate here, but I have concerns that the court case that's going on, that's exactly what's happening. Because as you say, as the Honourable Gentleman says, business does not like uncertainty. I know, again, from my business experience, what I do like to do, I don't mind risk. Risk is actually, business is based on risk, but it's about being able to control as much of the risk as possible. You're never going to be able to control 100% of it, but the more we can control, the more certainty we can bring into the equation, the better the outcome. Happily give way.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. It's quite a fascinating speech developing from him. Can I just take him back about 30 seconds to when he talked about consensus and openness and involving the public? Does he extend that involvement and openness to Parliament? And if so, what role precisely does he think Parliament ought to play in this process?
I've talked about the fact that in the that we'll be voting on the Great Repeal Bill, that we'll be voting on subsequent bills to actually bring many of the laws that are currently sitting at a European level into the UK, maybe scrapping some of them, keeping some of them, enhancing some of them even. But that will be very much down to Parliament to be able to vote on, to be able to tackle, and that will be coming up soon. With regard to leaving the EU, we will be continuing as parliamentarians to have this debate, to have these discussions. As the Secretary of State said just last week, he will be calling a number of debates through the usual channels when we have particular things to be debating on. Happily point.
I thank you for allowing me the intervention. I just wanted to double check on that point, that you did indeed say that there may well be some areas of European law upon the Great Repeal Bill and consultations that might happen within Parliament that may well be negotiated away when it gets brought to our Parliament.
So,
that there was, excuse me, Chairman, that you said that there will be areas of legislation when we're discussing the repeal bill that may well be dropped when we're bringing things over from European legislation.
The Great Repeal Bill is effectively domesticating all European law. Subsequent to that, you know, there is a lot of law, there's a lot of legislation. It's then up to Parliament to decide over a period of time what we do with that legislation. So that is very much a role for Parliament, frankly, in order to be able to do that. Yeah.
Which of all these European regulations that will be incorporated into UK law by the Great Repeal Bill is he most looking forward to reforming or eradicating?
What I'm really looking forward to, is to be able to take control and actually give this government to be accountable, that we can actually look our electorate in the eyes and actually say, you know what, if you don't like what I'm doing, if you don't like what we are pushing through as legislation, we're not going to sit there and blame Brussels. We're not going to sit there and blame any number of presidents that are sitting in Brussels and Strasbourg. It's our responsibility. We are accountable to you. And that's what I'm most looking forward to, taking control. But, you know, my view on Brexit is I've given a good few interventions, and I know other people want to speak. My view on Brexit isn't insular. It's quite the opposite. I'm actually really excited about the prospect of a bright future, lifting our head up to the world, trading with every continent, including Europe, and grabbing the opportunities that will follow. But let's be patient. Let's get this right and show the world how a democratic accountability, global free trade, and a fair, controlled immigration system aren't mutually exclusive. Let's all follow the path set for us by the British people and debate and discuss our independent future in a civilised, positive manner. Instead of being a semi-detached tenant of the European Union, carping from the sidelines, out of the Eurozone, out of Schengen, out of the social chapter, let's work on being friendly neighbours, working for our own common economic good, whilst remembering that there's a whole world beyond the political construct of the European Union. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question is, as on the order paper, I call Garant Davies.